some of you know, Ellen and I live in Oxford, in the UK, on the edge of one of the world's great educational establishments. Just a week or so before we came to the West Coast, a friend of ours emailed to say that he had heard that a well-known and highly respected philosopher from the university was giving a talk on the nature of consciousness. So we were naturally intrigued, and we went to the talk. I won't begin to try to describe the abstract, convoluted, and intellectual lines of reason that he used to try to describe the nature of awareness. But I will just quote one thing that he said. Some philosophers, I'm quoting now, some philosophers say that it is possible for consciousness to be aware of itself. These ideas should be put in the trash. Now, I'm touched, David, by your introduction of how gentle I am, but I have to confess, at this moment, I began to feel my sword rattling in its saber. I managed to hold on to myself till the end of the meeting, and I said this to him. Everybody in this room is aware that they are conscious. He pondered a moment, and I could see that he was reluctant, but nevertheless agreed with me. So then I observed that whatever it is that is aware that we are conscious must itself have two qualities. One, it must be present, and two, it must be aware. What would that be? Consciousness. That's what consciousness is. That which is present and aware. So I suggested to him, in the simple experience that each of us is now having, the simple experience that I am aware, right there is the experience of consciousness knowing its own being. Oh, no, you're going far too quickly. And he then took off again into lines of abstruse, convoluted, academic reasoning, which I failed to follow. And then when I remonstrated with him again, he simply turned away and took the next question. Profound ignorance masquerading as wisdom. All the worse for coming out of the mouth of a highly respected professor of philosophy at Oxford University. Not only does consciousness know its own being, consciousness never ceases to know its own being. In fact, in reality, consciousness never knows anything other than its own being. And this is everybody's primary, most intimate, most fundamental experience. If I were to ask you now the question, are you aware? You would pause Actually, in this crowd, none of you would have to pause too long. And you would answer yes. The question, am I aware, is a thought. The answer, yes, is a thought. What takes place in between those two thoughts? The experience of being aware that I am aware. In between those two thoughts, consciousness is divested of the objective limitations which it assumes in order to rise in the form of the finite mind and ask the question, am I aware? There is a plunge of the finite mind into its source between these two thoughts. And in that plunge of the finite mind or attention into its source, consciousness recognizes its own being. Recognizes, knows again its own being, which it seemed to overlook or forget when it rose in the form of the finite mind. And then the answer, yes, again, is an expression of the finite mind. But the experience itself of being aware that I am aware takes place between two thoughts. That it is not an experience of the finite mind. Consciousness needs to rise in the form of the finite mind if it wants to know something that is apparently other than itself. But in order to know itself, it doesn't need to rise. It need only remain resting in the knowing of its own being. And this knowing of its own being shines in the mind as the knowledge I, or I am, or I am aware. And it is felt in the heart as peace or happiness. How does infinite consciousness rise in the form of the finite mind? It simultaneously creates the body and identifies itself with it. And this conjunction of infinite consciousness plus the limitations of the body produce what is called the finite mind. In other words, the finite mind borrows its knowing, its quality of knowing from infinite consciousness. It borrows its apparent limitations from the body. And so in between consciousness and the body stands this entity called personal consciousness, the ego, the separate self, the finite mind. This finite mind, personal consciousness, the ego, never actually comes into existence. If consciousness is infinite, how could it possibly know something that was finite? What room is there in infinity for finiteness? As soon as a finite object arises in infinite consciousness, the finiteness of that object would displace a little bit of consciousness's infiniteness, and therefore consciousness would cease to be infinite. It is not possible for infinite consciousness to know a finite object or self. So for whom is there a finite object or self? For whom is there personal consciousness? For whom is there an ego? Not for consciousness, not for that which truly is. That which truly is only is and knows itself. The finite mind is only a real finite mind from the illusory point of view of the finite mind. The separate self is only a real separate self from its own illusory point of view. For that which truly is, the only consciousness there is, consciousness that knows no limits within itself. There is no object or other. In order to know an apparent object or other, consciousness must cease gazing at itself. It must seem to turn its attention away from itself and rise in the form of the finite mind by assuming the limitations of the body. It is only as that apparently finite mind that consciousness can turn its attention away from itself and direct its knowing towards an object. The object that the finite mind seems to know is made out of something called matter. Everything that takes place outside mind. In fact, matter is a concept that was invented by the Greeks 2,500 years ago to account for that part of our experience that takes place outside mind. They didn't have a word for consciousness in those days. They call it mind. So matter was the name they gave to this stuff that exists outside consciousness. For 2,500 years it seems to have passed our civilization by that we have never found anything outside consciousness. Physicists are still looking for the nature of this stuff called matter, or the nature and cause of this stuff called matter. They've been looking for it for 2,500 years. They've never found it, and they never will. It's not there. The belief that there is a world out there made out of matter is predicated upon the belief that there is a self in here made out of mind. If the mind turns its attention away from the objects that it seems to know and turns its attention back on the knowing with which it knows its experience, our attention is gradually drawn back and back and back and back towards its source. It is not a directing of the attention. It is a falling back of the attention. It is what Rumi referred to when he said, flow down and down and down in ever-widening rings of being. This sinking of the attention into its source. As the attention sinks into its source, it is, in most cases, gradually divested of all the limitations that thought and feeling have superimposed upon it. And at some point it stands revealed as it truly is. Infinite consciousness. Then, as the attention rises again, if we look very closely, the attention never leaves consciousness. Try now, with your attention, to attend to something just outside consciousness. Can any of you find that place? Can any of you find an edge to the field in which your attention is wandering? Once it becomes completely clear to us that the finite mind rises from infinite consciousness, and we watch the attention rising again in the form of thought and perception. These are the two forms in which the finite mind appears. We find that the very substance out of which thought and perception are made are only infinite consciousness. Thought cannot know consciousness, although it is made out of it, any more than a character in a movie can see the screen that it is made of. Likewise, perception cannot see consciousness, although it is made out of it. When thought tries to find the substance in which it appears, it projects its own single dimension onto consciousness. And instead of seeing consciousness, it sees time. Time is what consciousness looks like from the point of view of thought. Time is consciousness objectified by thought. Likewise, when we try to find the stuff that our perceptions appear in, we notice the perception of this screen over here, and then we notice the perception of that screen over there, and we ask ourselves, what is the stuff between these two perceptions? And we look at the two things, and we look at the stuff in between, and we call it space. Perception has simply superimposed its own limitations on consciousness. Space is what consciousness looks like from the illusory point of view of perception. Or we could say that space is consciousness objectified by perception. In order to know something other than itself, consciousness needs to rise in the form of the finite mind. But in order to know itself, it doesn't need the help of a puny, finite mind. To believe that consciousness needs the mind to know itself is like imagining that the sun needs the moonlight to illuminate itself. There is no moonlight. It is only the moon that believes that it shines with its own light. But the moon borrows its limited light from the infinite light of the sun. The sun is self-luminous. Consciousness is self-knowing. It is only the arrogance of thought that is. It is only the arrogance of the finite mind that is trying to validate and perpetuate its own illusory existence, that believes consciousness needs me, the finite mind, in order to know itself. It doesn't. Consciousness knows itself by itself, in itself, as itself. All it finds in itself is itself. There is no room in itself for anything other than itself. No object, from the point of view of consciousness, ever comes into existence. Existence means to come into being. From two Latin words, ex and sistere. Ex meaning out of, and sistere meaning to stand. The idea being that when something comes into existence, it stands out from the background of infinite consciousness. And as a result, we believe in our culture that objects have existence, and that when the object vanishes, its existence vanishes. No, objects do not have existence. Existence has objects from time to time. In fact, there is no real existence. There is no real standing out from the background of infinite consciousness. In other words, infinite consciousness is not the background of experience, although it is often found there first. If we are totally absorbed in the movie, the screen seems to be in the background of the movie. The screen is not in the background of the movie. The screen pervades the movie. But even that is a concession to the existence of something other than the screen. The screen doesn't pervade the movie. It is the movie. No thing comes into existence or goes out of existence. That which is never ceases to be. That which is not never comes into existence. The Bhagavad Gita. It is for this reason that Rumi said, knowledge of the world is a kind of ignorance. Knowledge of a world outside of consciousness, made out of stuff called matter, is a kind of ignorance. As William Wordsworth said, our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. He didn't really mean our birth. He meant the rising of the finite mind. The rising of the waking state mind is but a sleep and a forgetting. A kind of ignorance, as Rumi would say. The same understanding is expressed in the Bhagavad Gita. What is the waking state from the point of view of ignorance is sleep from the point of view of wisdom. What is waking from the point of view of wisdom is sleep from the point of view of ignorance. The poet Shelley said a similar thing. Life, like a dome of many-colored glass, stains the white radiance of eternity. Life, like a dome of many-colored glass, stains the white radiance of eternity. In fact, if we look closely in our experience, nothing really stains the white radiance of eternity. Nothing stains the knowing of our own being, which shines in the mind as the knowledge I am, or I am aware, and is felt in the heart as peace and happiness. Every experience leaves the white radiance of eternity. Every experience leaves our essential being pristine, clean, unscathed, unmodified, unhurt. No experience that any of us have ever had or could ever have has ever truly stained our essential being of infinite consciousness. So with great respect to Shelley, I would slightly change his words. Life, like a dome of many-colored glass, colors the white radiance of eternity. All experience is a coloring of our essential being of infinite consciousness. But consciousness never becomes any of the colors that it assumes. In fact, if we look even more closely in our experience, we can't even say that experience colors our essential being. So again, I would, with respect to Shelley, slightly modify his words. Life, like a dome of many-colored glass, shines with the white radiance of eternity. All that is ever known in experience is the knowing of it. Try now to find anything other than the knowing of your experience. Let your attention go wherever it wants. Ask yourself one question. Do I ever know or come in contact with anything other than the knowing of experience? Could I ever come in contact with anything other than the knowing of experience? Could I, consciousness, ever come in contact with anything other than the consciousness of experience? Is there any substance present in experience other than pure knowing? Not the knowing of something. We never find the something. We presume the something, but we never find it. That is, consciousness never finds it. Consciousness never finds anything other than itself. So when we explore our experience, whatever our experience might be, sitting peacefully, listening to a talk, a toothache, a deep depression, the taste of tea, a walk in the countryside. Wherever we go in experience, we don't find the knowing of experience. We find the knowing of knowing. And what is the we that knows knowing? There is no we, there is no I, apart from this knowing itself that knows itself. We can no longer even say that consciousness is everything. There are no things for consciousness to be the all of. To suggest that consciousness knows itself through the agency of a finite mind or a separate self is the ultimate blasphemy. It is to admit something other than God. It is to shrink God into a finite entity, a finite subject. It doesn't sit comfortably in our culture to say, I am God. You used to get crucified for it. But to say, I am infinite consciousness is just a confession of our intimate experience. It is to say, I am a finite self that is the true blasphemy. To say that there is a finite mind that knows a finite world made of matter, that is the true blasphemy. If we want to know the nature of that world, we have to know the nature of that with which it is known. The ultimate science is not the science of physics. It is the science of consciousness. Our culture, I believe, now finds itself in a similar position to that in which it found itself in the middle of the 16th century. When Copernicus presented his ideas about the heliocentric universe, he ushered in a new era of science which replaced the old religious worldview. Society had outgrown the forms that it itself had created in order to accommodate itself. We are now at a similar stage. Our society has outgrown the forms which conventional science has created in order to accommodate itself. And the signs of this are everywhere to be found. The new science is the science of consciousness. Sooner or later, we have to have the courage to face that fact. Until we know the nature of the knowing with which our experience is known, nothing true about the known can be known. In fact, it is never possible to know something true about anything objective. Why? Because everything that is known objective is known by the finite mind. And the finite mind is predicated on the presumption that I, consciousness, am limited. All knowledge, however fine that knowledge may be, is predicated on that assumption. If that assumption is explored, it is found to be faulty. So even our finest knowledge is only at best relative. It can never be absolutely true because it is founded on a presumption. The only absolutely true knowledge there is, when I say absolutely true, I mean a knowledge that doesn't change, is present throughout all states of waking, dreaming, and sleeping, and above all, a knowledge that is not known by something other than itself. That is the test of absolute knowledge. If something is known by something other than itself, it depends on that something other. All objective knowledge is relative to the presence of the finite mind, and the finite mind is only present during the waking and dreaming states. The only absolute knowledge there is the knowing of our own being, its knowing of itself in us, a knowledge which shines in the mind, shines in the finite mind as the knowledge I am, or I am aware, shines in our feelings as peace and happiness, and is revealed in our perceptions as the experience of beauty. Only that knowledge is absolutely true. It never changes under any circumstances, in any conditions, in any states. If we ever want to find peace in the world and happiness in ourselves, our knowledge individually and collectively has to be founded on that which is absolutely true. Any politics or scientific knowledge or personal relationship that is based on anything other than the absolute truth of our own being is doomed to failure. And this failure is felt by everyone in their hearts as the experience of suffering. Suffering is, in fact, a call from the depths of our being. It is, in fact, a call from happiness itself. Come back to me. You are looking for me in the wrong place. Cease rising in the form of attention, wandering in the realm of objects, looking for peace in situations, happiness in objects, love in relationships. Look for me where I really am. Look for me in the heart. Look for me at the source of attention, not its destiny. Out of compassion, the great spiritual and religious traditions have elaborated various means, various pathways back to the reality of our experience. But all these pathways are concessions, compassionate concessions to the belief and feeling of being a separate self. Ramana Maharshi said, I only elaborated the paths of self-inquiry and self-surrender because my students my devotees couldn't understand the absolute truth. In reality, there are no paths to God. God knows itself, by itself, through itself, in itself, as itself. There are no means to infinite consciousness other than infinite consciousness itself. Because from infinite consciousness's point of view, which is the only real point of view, there is only itself. What does that mean in terms of everyday, practical life? Does this only mean something when we're sitting at a conference talking about reality? It means that all experience is only infinite consciousness. It means that the taste of tea, the pavement we're walking on, the cutlery we hold in our hands, the relationships we have, it means everything is only God's infinite being. Do you live like that? Or do we just agree with each other at conferences like this? That is not enough. It is a beginning. Ellen opened a book at random early this morning and read a quote to me. It was a book that one of you gave me yesterday. Sorry, I can't remember who it was. And it said, when the path to God ends, the path in God begins. The path in God means to be only infinite consciousness, to know only infinite consciousness, and to love only infinite consciousness.